Senator Ted Cruz, how are you, sir?
Mark, I'm doing terrific. How are you tonight?
I'm annoyed, to be perfectly honest with you, since you asked. And there's a lot to be annoyed about, quite frankly.
There is.
You were on the border. We have absolute anarchy on the border. President proposes a budget that flatlines the border law enforcement, ICE, and the Border Patrol. He will not reverse course on policies, even though he's kind of dancing around some efforts. The inhumanity of this, the lack of compassion, Biden seems utterly unfocused on this. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it's an absolute disaster. And I've been to the border many, many times. It is by far the worst I've ever seen it. A couple of weeks ago, as you know, I brought together a group of 19 senators who all went down to the border in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas to see it firsthand. And what we saw was horrific. We went and joined the Border Patrol agents, the agents in their midnight patrol. We saw just caravans of people hiking north from the Rio Grande River, little kids walking on their own, young moms carrying infants, nursing the kids, just a sea of humanity. Is this giant tent city that they have built to accommodate this massive surge. Its capacity is 1,000 people. With COVID restrictions, its capacity is 250 people. When we were there, they had over 4,200 people crammed into cages, not 6 feet away from each other, not 3 feet away from each other, not even 3 inches away from each other. Side by side, children, little boys, little girls lying on the ground. There are no beds, there are no cots, there are no mats, lying on the ground, wrapped in reflective emergency blankets. The rate of COVID positivity is over 10% in that facility, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and this is a man-made crisis. Joe Biden, through a series of political decisions, caused this, and he's desperately trying to cover it up and ignore it.
Is there some benefit in there for him? I certainly think there is. Otherwise, why would he do this?
Well, I think it's a combination of two things. One, he has made promises to the radical left-wing groups on immigration. Today's Democratic Party is a strange amalgamation of special interest and radical groups. And essentially the way they operate, they've made the decision to give the crazies whatever the issue area is. So on immigration, it is the crazy left wing on immigration laws. On LGBT issues, it is the crazy left wing transgender advocates. It's this disparate collection of radicals. The radicals have demanded of Joe Biden that he promised not to enforce the immigration laws and not to deport anybody. And he's made those promises. That's what caused this crisis. He returned to catch and release. He pulled out of the Remain in Mexico policy. That created the crisis, and his hands are tied now effectively because he's promised not to do the steps it would take to fix this. I think, secondly, the broader Democratic Party supports open borders today because they view every single illegal immigrant who comes in as a future Democratic voter. That's why they support universal amnesty, because they want to take 12 million or 15 million or 20 million illegal immigrants, make them all voters immediately because they believe the overwhelming majority of them will vote for Democrats. And Biden and Kamala Harris are willing to tolerate the crime and the sexual abuse and the drugs that are coming over the border, all as a price for future political power.
We only have a certain amount of time, so I want to move around, Senator. Let's look at the Middle East. You have been a unequivocal supporter of the State of Israel, one of the great leaders, as a matter of fact, in the country, in the U.S. Senate on this subject. The Democrat Party, not so much, even led by Chuck Schumer, who's considered a pro-Israel Democrat. And yet, Chuck Schumer, while voting against the Iran deal, I happen to know, as a matter of fact, behind the scenes was supporting it at Obama's direction. Biden has appointed radical after radical in his national security and foreign policy team. He's now funding, or wants to fund, the Palestinians, despite the fact that they've used American dollars to kill people. We have the Abraham Accords that were breaking out in the Middle East. And now Biden also wants to, through the back door, provide enormous sums of money to the Iranian regime and open negotiations with them, despite the fact that they want to build ICBMs and put nuclear warheads on them and aim them at our cities. What do you make of this foreign policy?
Well, I think they consistently want to alienate and abandon our friends, and they consistently want to kiss up to and appease our enemies. The Trump administration was the most pro-Israel administration that you or I have ever seen in our lifetimes. The Obama administration before that was the most anti-Israel administration that you and I have ever seen in our lifetimes. And I think Joe Biden wants to give Barack Obama a run for the money. You look at the radicals from the Obama administration, that's who they put in charge of their foreign policy. As you know, in December of 2016, after the presidential election, the Obama administration orchestrated UN Resolution 2334, which is built on a pile of lies. It declares much of modern-day Israel to be illegitimate and illegally occupied territory. It declares the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem to be illegitimate, illegally occupied territory. It declares the Wailing Wall to be illegally occupied territory. And it was the Obama-Biden administration that orchestrated that. Samantha Power, the UN ambassador, has been nominated to be the head of USAID. Not only that, Wendy Sherman, who led the Obama negotiation on the disastrous Iran nuclear deal, has been nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of State under Biden. And I think the next 4 years we're going to see them sending money to the enemies of Israel and the enemies of America. You mentioned the Palestinian Authority. The Biden administration quietly has sent hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, which is in a unity government with Hamas and is paying millions of dollars to the families of terrorists who murder Americans and murder Israelis in violation of the Taylor Force Act, which I helped pass, that prohibited U.S. taxpayer dollars from going to support terrorism against America. In just a couple of months, the Biden administration has turned its back on federal law and is sending money that is going to the terrorists, targeting Americans, targeting Israelis.
The Biden administration has gone rogue in many respects, Ted. It's gone rogue with respect to the Civil Rights Act and girls' sports in our high schools and so forth and colleges. It has gone rogue with this critical race theory and so-called equity. It's making unilateral decisions out of the Oval Office. He thinks he's Franklin Roosevelt. He wants to be bigger than Franklin Roosevelt. We have, in my way of thinking, I'd be interested in your input here. We have two things going on at the same time, as the audience knows. I've explained this from my perspective. Number one, in the Oval Office, we have an autocrat. That's the way he thinks. So we have somebody who wants to rule with centralized power, even though he doesn't have a majority in the Senate. The Constitution gives the vice president the vote. I got it. And in the House, they have the slimmest majority in 100 years, but they want to ram through everything humanly possible. They didn't run on these things. And then in Congress, we have the opposite. We have basically the mobocracy, which is they will violate the Budget Reconciliation Act. They will try to destroy the filibuster. They will try and change and nationalize our election laws and so forth and so on. So we have these two forms of tyranny that at the same time, and what fuses them together is the Democrat Party. That is, we're supposed to have checks and balances where the Congress jealously protects its authority, and the presidency, same thing. But they're working together because they have the same aims. Does that make sense?
It does. I think you're right in that. And I think today's Democrat Party bears very little resemblance to the Democratic Party we've seen historically in this country. Today's party is about one thing. It is about power. It is about maximizing and preserving political power. That's Joe Biden's number one priority. That's Chuck Schumer's number one priority. That's Nancy Pelosi's number one priority. That means a couple of things. Number one, they have made the decision that the way they stay in power is they let the crazy radicals drive every issue area. So, for example, you talked about the destruction of girls' sports and women's sports. That's because on issues of LGBT, the most extreme transgender activists are the ones who set the agenda. Same is true on immigration. Same is true on just about every other policy issue. It is the radical activists who they are deferring to. In the Senate, the people whose agenda is being implemented are Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders and AOC in the House. Joe Biden's made the decision, give the angry left what they want, and he stays in power. Secondly, the Democrats justify this by the ends justify the means. They have convinced themselves Donald Trump broke the Democratic Party. They've convinced themselves all Republicans are evil, bigoted racists. Therefore, everything is justified in fighting the Nazis, and they believe anyone who disagrees with them is a Nazi. And a final element of this is there is a party unity and discipline in the Senate. It's a 50-50 Senate. One Democrat could stop any of this crazy garbage they're passing, and not a single Democrat has the spinal fortitude to do so because they're collectivists, they're statists. They follow orders. Schumer snaps his fingers, and they fall into line.
It's very, very well put. Well, we've run out of time. We could spend a lot of time with you, Senator, and we want to appreciate everything you're doing. Keep up the fight, because the people out here are very upset about what's happening to their country. Millions and millions of us, and we're not going to give up. We're going to fight back, and we need leaders like you. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to fight at every step, and let me just give your listeners a brief word of encouragement. The worse they get, the crazier they get, the more likely it is that the pendulum swings back to sanity. I believe 2022 is going to be a very good election. I believe 2024 is going to be a very good election because they're listening to the radicals, and most of the American people don't want crazy radical ideas, including just a final point. Just today, we had a confirmation hearing on their nominee to be the head of civil rights of the Department of Justice. She is a radical who has organized conferences celebrating cop killers and has repeatedly advocated abolishing the police. This is one of their senior officials at the Department of Justice. These are the radicals. That's going to result in the country coming back in the direction of Sanders.
And tell me, will there be a single Democrat to vote against her?
Not a one. Every one of them. And by the way, at her hearing, she demonstrated this willingness to lie. So I cross-examined her, and she said, I don't advocate abolishing the police. I never advocated abolishing the police. She wrote an op-ed last year, not 10 years ago, last year, saying the Black Lives Matter movement has produced a unifying call to abolish the police. The title of her article is Abolish the Police. She has 3 different paragraphs saying we need to cut funding to the police, and she sat there under oath and says, I've never advocated cutting funding to the police. It is Orwellian, their willingness to just lie, and not a Democrat cares. They will all fall in party line, despite the fact that she had celebrated cop killers as political prisoners. It is truly radical. And I asked her, 2 of the cop killers she celebrated, one killed a Philadelphia police officer, one killed a New Jersey state trooper. My final question is, what would you say to a Philadelphia police officer watching this hearing today, or a New Jersey state trooper watching this hearing today, that you lionized and celebrated a cop killer who killed one of their colleagues? And she had no answer to that. And no Democrat, as far as I can tell, seems to care.
Her name is Clark. She has said so many horrific things and believes in so many horrific things, and her current position is with a radical left-wing organization. And I just hope we don't get a handful of Republicans peeling off like we did the other day for Wendy Sherman. We'll see. Ted Cruz, I want to thank you, my friend. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. God bless.
You too.